Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest video. There is no epic loot here, only puns, taken from the website ReUpload. The link to the story will be down below. If you wish to support the author, please head over there and give them support. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. There is Discord, merch, Patreon, bunch of other stuff too, so have a look in the description, you might be surprised. Anyways, now on to the fiction. As always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 160, A Royal Tribute. Waves lapped at her feet, the warm ocean environment of her newest floor only doing so much to distance Delta from all that was going on. Delta hugged herself as the people trailed into her dungeon during the day were near non-stop. It was like her front door had been taken off its hinges, and now her home was public property. All the people from Fairplay had set up rotations, making maps, destroying her monsters to see what they would drop as loot, and in simple terms, were being pests. The experience was akin to having ants crawling in her hair, but New kept having to smack with a newspaper. Not that Delta tried to look that much. Actual dungeon delvers weren't fun to watch after experiencing Rudy, Dio, Kemi, and even Estelle's groups. It didn't matter if her monsters returned after time. Delta could neither bear to watch them suffer in any capacity, nor the treatment they endured from the indifferent Fairplay folks. But even factoring that in, Delta classified found that there were three types of Fairplay people. The first were the simplest and most common type to enter her dungeon. They were the hired help, the people who wore the colors or symbols but were there for the paycheck. They did the bare minimum, didn't push too hard, and in general they lacked any impressive magical equipment or even the experience needed to get far. Not quite adventurous, but not quite helpless. More often than not, her goblins and rooms kept them at bay. Swa was eager for revenge and ended up giving more than a few nasty burns to take back to the road with them. One group made it to Farah, who simply clobbered them with a chair. The second were the previously mentioned adventurers. Those were closer to the style to Estelle and Kemi's groups, a tougher lot that often managed to reach Bran and Bacon with continuous success. They seemed to have joined up for access to the dungeon, but didn't completely jive with Fairplay as people. Not that they were angels, they seemed to be more thrill-seekers and actively prodded each other's to test monsters and trap. And a lot of knives were stolen by news pops out signs because of their jumpy nature. They became even more skittish after running into Bran. The first time this happened, they seemed to laugh at the idea of a goblin boss without a horde of minions to back it up, swaggering up to the boss with swords drawn, but hardly any tactics in place. They labored under the impression of Fran being just the first floor boss. Delta greatly enjoyed the expressions when Fran demonstrated exactly why he was a strong, independent goblin who needed no army. As the thrashings continued and the stories began to spread, people began to enter the boss room with far more trepidation than before. That made Delta feel better. Bran and Bacon deserved some respect after everything. However, something Delta noticed made her frown. These adventurers, their seeds, their little pieces of lost little brother in all of the people, were far more developed, and Delta was truly worried she wouldn't be able to purify them all due to the sheer volume of being drawn to durance. It was a little interesting to see the seeds in different states of growth and nature. They varied in dozens of levels of strength, but none came close to the level found in the people of Durance, such as Rudy or Dio. Even mana-starved Dio's seed had been something else. Aside from that, a lot of the groups had been low-tier mixed with some hidden gems. Some had artifacts that looked as if they were mass-produced in a magic factory, while others used custom equipment made to their specific mastery. It was usually the latter that made it to the boss room. They understood the rules, allowing them some leeway, which some used to skip some of the harder rooms, while others learned to completely stick to non-lethal runs to see if that helped. To Delta's delight, a few even seemed to turn into the badge of honor to make it to the boss room without actually beating any of her monsters, while still completing the room challenges. New informed her that there was a rumor he heard in the group's whisper about the secret challenge modes. Delta tried not to think about poor, innocent folk trying to flip that switch. The third type was the most alarming, consisting of Fairplay's inner members. These people Delta dubbed as scrubbed. Their manner, their seeds, even their very being radiated an artificial light, which reminded her of the buzzing hallway light in a hospital, awash in a pale, dull, wild light. Pure was not the right word. She had met Kemi and seen purity. This was like a favorite shirt that had gone through the wash one too many times and had completely faded. A photograph whitened by time, a soul eroded by purpose. Delta shortened and called them scrubs to keep it simple. These people had identical weapons, carbon copy magics, cookie-cutter tools, and even more similar stances. They did not negotiate or bargain with Delta or her monsters. Whether it was simple path with a goblin on it or a hellish road covered in lava, Fairplay scrubs would sooner set themselves on fire than suffer a dungeon monster to live. It was scary to watch the self-assurance of their spirits, unbending until they snapped in half. All the ones she saw wore a badge of sorts, with the single sliver finger touching the unsettling familiar round spherical object, and that was their goal. Delta didn't want these people touching her core. She really didn't want that. The only upside was that whenever Delta was bloated with the mana from all these people, almost ready to burst in pain, Rudy seemed to sense it and closed the dungeon off to outsiders. Delta heard from Hob and Gob that she got a lot of foul language for that, and more than a few people had whispered that she was a dungeon simpleton, someone who apparently didn't get the dungeons were basically below everyone in the social hierarchy of rights. Delta asked the goblins to point out anyone who did this to Rudy if they came into the dungeon. Somehow, the difficulty mode for those people was automatically set to stage 3. Still, the break was nice, as it allowed Delta to splurge mana on things on her 3rd floor, like paintings or more rugs to give it more ambience, while she also spent some time on her 4th floor, getting the gluttonous amounts of shells, stones, and starfish for her island beaches. If this is how normal dungeons get supplied, I'm not surprised Bro and Sis moved on to putting actual people in charge of a core. I'm barely scratching my 4th floor, and I can barely stop myself from turning them into insane death traps, she sighed, and a hand on her chin. It's not death traps, it's natural selection, little helpers, Nu said casually, as he drew up plans for a 4th floor. But all Delta could see on his blueprint was a massive squid eating screaming Fairplay people. Nu, what if it gets worse? I feel itchy with them in my 1st floor. How will I feel with them when they hit my 2nd, then 3rd? It's bearable, but what if I don't want to nap or think, or just be alone for 10 minutes, Delta explained, as they both sat on the beach on the 4th floor, basking in the radiant fake sunshine. I'll stop being sarcastic for a moment and put aside the easy answer of make them afraid, and say, treat them like your squishy human nose, he suggested, as the squid on the blueprints gained a laser beam mounted on each arm. My nose? Delta repeated, bemused. Sure, you see it all the time, but you don't. The mind adapts, and you're not just human. You're a dungeon too. Dungeons are designed to have that feeling as normal. People are just boogers on your nose. Phase them out, he went on blithely. Delta pondered that as she stood off the sand castle throne and began to walk to the ocean surface. Phase it out, she muttered. He made it sound so easy. I'd be happy to let loose my Mecha Bone Kraken Mark 14 and cull them if you prefer, Nu called. Nose, nose, nose. Delta tapped her head as she walked. Delta was a people person. She enjoyed interacting with people, watching them grow into better people as they helped Delta be a better person. But if the people coming to her with the little safe haven were all intent of being unreasonable, she might have to take breaks from them. Boundaries were just that important as work. A work email arriving at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday can wait until Monday morning. Delta nodded to herself, accepting this as her truth now. If people didn't respect her boundaries, Delta wouldn't respect their property, pride, or personally held beliefs that involved hurting others. Fair was fair. She paused as a group made it to Fran and Bacon. The leader of this particular group of scrubs was a little more washed out than the others. On his chest was the same badge, but 2 fingers around the orb. Delta snorted to herself. She had lived long enough to see herself become a dreaded mythical creature. Delta had become so unreasonable to handle that she had summoned a manager. With the thought, she moved to the boss room to see the white sands of the Colosseum-style edges ignite with flames from the nearby scones as the entertainment got started, the doors opening outwards to reveal a hall connecting to Farah's bar. Delta took a look to see how they got past Farah's unscathed when she saw the goblin maiden was busy on the 3rd floor with Troll Cookling. Ah, dumb luck. The 5-man group didn't really feel like people so much as a homogeneous crowd. Any unique features such as hair color or eyes or even mannerisms seemed to be held in check by their practiced, emotionless, and uniform. Said uniforms looked a little tight on them. Delta whistled innocently to herself as she took a seat firmly on Fran and Bacon's side of the room. Another downside to all this activity was it was quite hard to make minor adjustments to the 1st floor due to the constant outside interference of people. So, when they began to figure things out that Delta hadn't quite intended, such as they used water magic in the Mushroom Grove, it overgrew, trapping Bori somewhat to allow quick escape with little challenge. The storeroom could just be blitzed from the outside with the use of explosions, rendering Mary's available tools down to nothing. But they had not found Maestro's tunnel just yet. It seems that the fair play officer was still keeping the secret to herself. All in all, the 1st floor had some issues that hadn't been revealed until now, thanks to the volume of people trying to get creative. It was something that she'd have to work on. She wondered if she could make a mini-boss that would grow if it got too wet for the grove, like one of those neat dinosaur sponge toy things. Wait, she could just make dinosaurs on another floor. Her menu pinged and a request to assist, which returned a, "Would you like to?" Delta put a pin in it for later. She watched as her 1st floor boss Fran strode in on Bacon with a quiet power to him. The room's enchantments worked in place, and Fran soon seemed to gain strength within himself. But Delta noticed something. Unlike the other groups, one of the members seemed exhausted, tired, weak. He was no fighter, but his ink-stained fingers reminded Delta of writing reports. But why? Why was that a familiar sensation? The simple fact was that Fran grew stronger to the average power of the group coming into his room, meaning that he should always be a challenge up to a point. But how now fair play brought a very weak person with them, and by the rules of averaging things out, Fran wasn't as tough as he could be. Did they figure out the trick, or did they get lucky? Delta mumbled to herself as Fran offered them clemency, but as before, the group ignored him and spread out around the 2nd-ranked officer, whose rapier looked different. Delta eyed the weapon and felt a little horrified. It looked to be a magical weapon summoned forth by a man, but from what Delta saw, the tool was his seed, himself, in a manner. How on earth did they learn not to control the seed, but push it into submission like that without a dungeon? It was also a little wrong to see something like someone's seed being used as a tool of battle. Delta could only liken it to someone using their dismembered hand as a weapon while still bleeding from the stump. It was half as long as his main body, but instead of metal, it looked to be made out of some sort of wood at a distance. But when Delta peered closer, she saw it was closer to a crystallized tree branch. Between the strength manipulation and the odd weapon, the uneasy feeling in her chest grew. The only thing good about the whole thing was that the people's seeds were pretty much inert or transmuted. If there was any trace of Little Brother left, Delta could not sense it within either her human mind or the dungeon's senses. "Have at thee!" Fran thundered as Bacon stomped on the ground before charging, his steed picking up speed as he brushed forward, kicking more sand up into his wake. The group didn't scatter like the more inexperienced groups, but held their posture. 2 of them lifting lances to create a death wall if Fran continued to charge. Normal people wouldn't push Fran back with simple lances, but these were neither normal people, nor did they have simple tools. Fran made Bacon swerve, sending a cloud of sand over the intruders to distract him as he brought his own lance down to bear. One of the people tried to counter with the shaft of his own spear, but while they made it be better than normal folks, Fran was still a boss monster. Delta's boss monster at that. The spear snapped, and the man suffered a nasty gash down his front before Bacon turned and donkey kicked him across the field. sending him out of bounds. Delta was a little worried about his health, but one of the others had used a sort of pale healing magic that felt almost without faith and more, purpose. It didn't wake the man, but he wouldn't die. Delta would need some sort of stasis or healing effect to keep people from dying as the fight went on. If the people couldn't get medical aid or were unaware of their allies' plight, then Delta would have to step up her game and do it herself. The second-rank officer swung his odd weapon, and when Fran's lance clashed with it, there was a distorting warble in the air, and it sounded like a tuning fork being abused. The impact was almost visible, and the force pushed Fran back and gave the man grounds to push his attack. Delta watched as Fran's lance seemed to almost lose physicality for a moment before the mana reasserted itself. Delta stood up as New pinged her from the second floor, demanding updates. The officer struck again with two of his companions, raining fireballs and arrows down on either side, forcing Fran to retreat or charge. Fran did not retreat. They clashed again, and this time, when the man struck Bacon's side, the cut spread out and frost coating her surface. The dungeon mana holding Bacon together became weak, and some of its strength was snapped. Delta's heart dropped. Anti-dungeon weapons, anti-mana tools, made from seeds of Little Brother. Just as that began to feel unfair, Fran hooked his lance under the man's foot and toppled him, sending his weapon skittering away for a second before the sand slowed it down. It seemed that they weren't expecting actual combat skills from Fran more than bash and charge. "Night Rush!" Fran cried, activating some skill that he'd been practicing. Blinking, Delta watched as the secondary core inside Fran began to pulse, feeding him mana that was mostly Delta's, but also a little unique flavor of his own. Delta really had so much to keep track of, and knew was a horrible secretary. Fran vanished before teleporting to one side of the arena and dashed across in a flash of light that sent waves and sand parting like waves, and the air rushed past. He stopped, then repeated his trick 2 more times, rendering the mage and one of the spearmen unconscious. "Field lines adapt! Central position! Eyes to the east and west!" the officer yelled, a little more panicked now as he scrambled for his seed rapier. Fran's luminous eyes turned to where Delta was sitting, awaiting a judgment like a royal knight seeking permission from his queen. With a dramatic flair, Delta put a hand out in front of her, thumb sticking out sideways. The thumb was turned downwards. "Night Rush Extreme!" 5 lines erupted in a star formation across the stage, leaving smoking lines in the sand and at the end of Fran's lance glowing cherry red. Fran looked down at the terrified fighter. "I'm just a receptionist," he pleaded to the goblin boss. "Take your lunch break, scribe, and make it a long one," Fran rumbled, and the man fled the room, screaming. The seed rapier flicked out of existence, and Delta could only stare at the sand that had been touching it, the dead grey inert mass that had been replaced slowly. It was too crucial for the second officer to take it. It had been akin to performing a soul lobotomy with toothpicks. But she eyed the fallen man and smiled. There was something she could try. "Mother, that look is the worst thing I've faced today," Fran muttered as he watched Delta move closer to the fallen man. "Shush, Fran. I'll do my thing, you shake their pockets out," she instructed the boss. "Shinies. I like shinies." "You're staring," Mass said. Princess Surma turned to him with a blink, then flushed a little. "Apologies, Mass. I've just never seen such a... She struggled to find the right word for the scene before her, and 3 men holding the 4th upside down over a keg as a man turned blue from a lack of oxygen, but not alcohol. "Festivities," she concluded with grace. The tavern of the small town was fascinating, as they had straw on the floor, a door leading to the stables to toss drunks, an outhouse, and more. Nearby, Lorsa sipped a tiny glass of something that she told Surma was lemonade, but fun. She blended into the shadows far too well for it to be an accident. Surma had not often been out of the castle and never had seen outside of the capital in such a fashion. Everything was new when it came to the people, disguised mostly in snooty but not snob clothes, as Mass described it. Surma was an oddity, but not too likely to stand out. "If you want to do a stand, I can arrange it, but it's not fun nor tasty. I prefer fruit juice," Matt said brightly, and Surma gave a small smile. When she was queen, she'd plant a grove of fruits from around the world for him. Lorsa gave her a thumbs up from behind Mass, the meaning of which Surma couldn't decipher at all. Still, when she knocked down her father's tomb and buried him in a pauper's grave instead, there'd be plenty of space for new gardens. No. She'd be doing her best to eliminate the poverty that gripped the city's lower quarter, so pauper graves would be out of style. A ditch, then. "What are you thinking about?" Mass asked, around a leg of lamb. "Oh, delicate princess things," she said airily. "I can listen, I don't mind," he promised. "Do you think that I would be a good, She lowered her voice. "Queen?" she asked her knight. Mass didn't even stop chewing. "Yep," he replied instantly. "How?" she pressed, needing to know what was going on in his head other than breathing and eating. The boy was rich with wisdom if he just shared his thoughts more. "Same way I know the sun rises every morning and water is wet, or good food is awesome. You just will be, just are," he shrugged. Lorsa downed her drink and gestured for 3 more glasses from the bar, eagerly. Surma felt a warmth in her chest as she hadn't since she was younger. "I believe that I can be that queen you think I am, if you're by my side," she whispered to Mass. "We're sitting next to each other. I'm definitely by your side," Mass said brightly, as he offered her his spare leg of lamb, dripping in some gravy. Lorsa buried her head in her hands. Surma stared at that leg of lamb, then took it without grace or manners and bit into it. It was overcooked, but as long as she was sharing it with Mass, it was delicious. Later, when she got too warm, she stepped outside for a moment, not wanting to bother Lorsa or Mass eating match over the more lambs. They were like wild animals gnawing on bones, and Surma needed fresh air. She exhaled as she went to check on the carriage, but stopped as someone put a knife to her throat from behind. "Your loving sibling sends their regards," the man hissed. Surma struggled, kicked back, and making the man kneel over for a moment. She got only a few steps back, and he grabbed her long hair. She was only halfway to durance, so close to being the queen, having a long reign of prosperity with Mass. She slammed her hands back, and the man cried out as something cracked in his chest before she reached to her side and slashed her hair down on her head, freeing herself finally. She turned in rage, but the man was simply gone. Strands of her hair fell gently, raining down on a curious orange slime that was staring at her wide eyes. Did you see where he went?" she panted, and the slime just burbled cutely. "He must have fled, fearing he took too long." Surma sighed as Lorsa crashed through the tavern wall in rage, a second assassin in her hands. She stopped when she saw Surma with the slime. "I got one too," Mass yelled, as he held up an unconscious imp creature. "He tried to murder my steak," Mass announced. He stopped when she saw Surma, and she felt dread in her stomach. Her hair. She must look horrible in the gloom and hollow light, and even worse during the day. "I'm here," he said, coming close and moving to her side, as he promised before. "Boy," the slime said. Mass gasped. "It's orange! We should cook it in soup. Slimes are full of nutrients. An orange one must taste super weird and healthy," he told Surma, as Lorsa had gone pale. The slime looked up at him and simply burbled again. Master, durance," the imp croaked in his sleep. Surma picked the slime up and hugged it. It felt warm. "Let's pay for the damages and leave," Surma said quietly, putting the slime over her shoulder as it seemed to be highly affectionate. Lorsa watched as the hulking Monster King's aura was compressed into a small form before it coughed out a boot with a foot still in it, the princess and her knight blissfully unaware of the process. This had, gotten complicated real fast. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Parky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakul, and Arcadian.